Again, we're so happy and feel so fortunate for the whole range of great speakers that we have. Today's panel, our afternoon panel, again, of faith leaders, is now going to focus a little more on the advocacy side, and we're fortunate to have some of the leading faith-based advocates in Washington joining us today. And leading that panel, we have someone who is very well steeped in security and arms affairs and in the humanitarian consequences of nuclear arms, Mr. Walter Pincus. Walter, I'll let you take it from there.
In 1970, I was running an investigation for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on the military involvement in foreign policy, and decided that nuclear weapons was a subject that the Foreign Relations Committee had never looked into. In those days, in 1970, the only committee on the Hill that could monitor and get information about nuclear weapons was the Joint Atomic Energy Committee. And when I first started asking questions about nuclear weapons on behalf of the chairman, I was told that only the Joint Atomic Energy Committee could inquire. As part of the investigation, myself and the other staff members, one of the ironies of the way Senator Fulbright ran investigation is the total staff was myself and a lawyer. And therefore you sort of controlled everything and you could keep track of what's going on. And as part of this inquiry, we spent 6 months traveling the world. And one of the things I started doing before going into a country was to send a questionnaire asking both the State Department and the Pentagon people in a country whether there were American nuclear weapons in the country, what was the agreement to bring them in, what was the agreement to use them, and what was the agreement to take them out. And one of the first surprises, if not shocking thing, was that nobody had ever asked those three questions together. And in fact, in two countries, the ambassador didn't know that there were nuclear weapons in his country because the information wasn't shared. And in one country, the country didn't know there were nuclear weapons there. It was the perfect way to get education on nuclear weapons. And one theme that developed out of that is, first of all, you had to find out the facts. You had to find out the facts of what the weapons were, what they were going to be used for, where they were, and what the strategy was. And it's something that became very important to me. Because what I learned as I traveled around is, despite the fact that very smart people invented these weapons, there weren't very smart people thinking about how to use them. One of the things went on right after World War II is that every branch of the military service wanted its own weapon. The Air Force, in those days the Army Air Force, was prime among the military services. And therefore, things like the first testing at Crossroads in Bikini was really set up so that the Navy could show that it could survive a nuclear war. And there was a big fight in setting the test up because the Air Force wanted to put the warships that were going to be in Bikini Lagoon closer together so more of them would be destroyed when the bomb went off to show the Navy was in trouble. And the Navy argued they had to be spread apart because that's the way they really were fighting in battle. And that inter-service rivalry about weapons has gone on till today. And so what you had at the end of World War II is we started building all sorts of weapons. The Navy built atomic anti-sub weapons. You drop them over the back of a destroyer and have a nuclear explosion undersea. The Army, which is sort of left out of this, convince the labs to build nuclear artillery shells, which the people in Los Alamos thought was really an interesting problem, because if you remember, the first nuclear weapon was about the size of an oil railroad car. And the idea of putting a nuclear weapon inside a shell that was 8 inches in diameter was a real task. But they did it. And we had eventually, in the mid-60s, 2,500 nuclear artillery shells in Europe with a range of 9 miles. And none of you, except maybe me and a few others, are old enough to remember that we used to test those in Nevada and march troops into in the wake of a blast. Needless to say, we ran into great trouble of people getting the effects of radiation. And it's partly how we learned about the effects of radiation. And so I kept studying nuclear weapons after the Fulbright Committee, and then in 1977, I wrote what I still think is probably the most important piece I ever wrote about the nuclear neutron artillery shells and the neutron warhead for the Lance missile. And it came about, and the Carter administration created a great uproar, a big debate in this country and a big debate in Europe, because the Europeans were reawakened to the idea that we had short-range nuclear weapons in Europe that can only be used on their territory. And they didn't like it. And we certainly wouldn't like it if they were being used on our territory. So in the end, Carter deferred production of it. Eventually, Reagan produced parts of it, and President George H.W. Bush, in one of the great forgotten arms control moves, did away with all American tactical nuclear weapons. It's one of the great ironies that he's not remembered for that, because it's the biggest step we've ever taken in disarmament, and it got overcome by all sorts of problems he ran into in his reelection. So the lesson to me, and the lesson I always teach, I teach at the Stanford program here in Washington, is when you undertake looking at an issue, you've got to first find out all the facts. The morality of nuclear weapons doesn't count in the final analysis. To me, one of the great ironies is President Obama, in order to get the New START treaty, had to agree to produce a new generation of weapons, or Congress would not have approved the treaty. So you can think all you want about what's right and what's moral. But the fact is, this is a democracy, and not everybody agrees with you. And therefore, you have to argue the issue, not on the morality. You've got to argue the issue on the facts. So one of the things I hope you come out of this thinking about is trying to know as much about nuclear weapons as the people who are for them, so you can deal with their arguments, because that's the way you win in a political system. So with that as an opening, let me sort of introduce the panel, and I'll do it in the order in which they've sort of asked to be done. Eric Sapp is Executive Director of the American Values Network, as a political consultant, working essentially with Democrats and interest groups in the liberal nature. He will speak first. Second will be David Culp, the legislative representative of the Friends Committee for National Legislation, who's been working on these issues that go, I guess, as back as mine, maybe not quite as far, but was influential in doing away with the nuclear testing, and also with something called the RRW, the Reliable Replacement Warhead, which was the idea of building a new warhead but not calling it new, that was defeated. In third place will be Marie Dennis, co-president of Christi, the Global Catholic Peace Movement, and who was worked for the Maryknoll Office for Global Concerns. And finally, Rabbi David Saperstein, director of the Religious Action Center for Reform Judaism, who my paper, so you have to believe it, said is the quintessential religious lobbyist on Capitol Hill. So I'll turn it over to Eric.
Okay, thank you. And would like to start just by thanking all of you for being here and for having this event. It's such an important conversation, and I must say I'm humbled and honored to be up here with this panel. I have known the two Davids for a while. I've looked up to them as I've come into this work, and while Marie and I have not worked as much closely together, one of the first groups when I started into faith and politics we worked with was Pax Christi. So it is a joy and honor to be here on the stage with you all. And as I thought about kind of what can I contribute to this conversation, I went back to, as we talk about paths forward, what we can do as a faith community, maybe I should look at what the faith community is good at. And one thing we are very good at is telling stories. And I found that as a community, the way faith is very real, it is very current, it is about how we shape our lives, but oftentimes it is informed by looking back at stories of what has happened, of the best examples from our past and those who have preceded us. And so I figured I'd kick us off with just two stories to help maybe put a little meat on the bones of how the faith community can contribute best to this conversation. And I'll start with that by just very quickly on American Values Network. And Ms. Pincus talked about this, the importance of understanding who we are working with and how we affect things through the political system, not just through what we believe. And at American Values Network, our mission statement is that we seek to align what's right with what works politically and economically, believing that that's the best way to bring about real and lasting change. And what we found in our advocacy work is that the best way to make a difference is not to tell people what is right, to say this is what we think you should do, but to make yourself valuable to them and help them to see that what you believe is right is actually in your interest. And this is something that I think the faith community is especially well equipped for. First example that I had, and my entrance actually to a lot of this nuclear work, was the New START Treaty. As we've heard, it was a long process. There were many people in the trenches for years and many more for the year leading up to it. As with many things, I came in late, and we were actually brought into the broader coalition right after and during the election. And I will be honest, I didn't, like many Americans, did not know what the New START Treaty was when we were first approached about it. And it was kind of the week of the election. I was learning about it. We committed to join this cause, and I was getting really excited. I mean, it was such a black and white issue. It's so obvious, as with everything discussed today. There was no question on what was right. And I'm getting excited. I've learned stuff. We're apart. I get in the car. I'm driving. I remember this very clearly, driving to work, listening to NPR. It's the day after the election. They're talking about the lame duck, what's going to happen. And I've got about a half-hour commute into work. And these are the priorities. These are priorities. I listed them all out. You had immigration. You had climate. You had all the budget deficits. You had an omnibus spending bill. This is what has to happen in the lame duck. And right before I pull into my office, one of the pundits says, oh, and there's this other thing. It's the New START Treaty. It should have been a no-brainer. Reagan supported it. It passed by like a 95-0 vote the last time around. But it's stalled right now, and all the other people said, yeah, this is an example. Washington's broken. It doesn't stand a chance. And so I get to work on my first day on this, and I hear, this doesn't stand a chance. And I'm like, Well, 6 weeks later, of all the issues that were laid out, all the political experts agreed were going to be what happened. The one that was passed and ratified was the New START Treaty. And one of the key reasons was the faith community and an approach to this issue. All the things that were up on the table were important. They were right. They had to get done. One of the things that really made the New START Treaty passed was it became in the interest of our leaders to work it. It was something that Democrats, after the shellacking they took in 2010, needed to do something. They needed to show that they could accomplish something. And quite honestly, they kind of wanted to position themselves in a little more centrist place. And having the New START Treaty supported by the faith community, supported by our military leaders, and creating this triangulation in the political context is where, at the end of the day, these were political decisions on what went to the floor, what was pushed. And it was the political context that the faith community helped create that accomplished a lot of that. So there was a great deal of effective lobbying that was done by this community. It was nearly 100,000 evangelicals and Catholics signed petitions in some of the key Senate states saying, this is something that we see as a top priority. This is a moral imperative for you to do. There were op-eds that were put out, and then right before the vote, I won't mention the names of the senators, but a couple senators made this big push saying, we can't stay in session to pass New START because that would bring us close to Christmas. It would be an insult to Jesus and to Christmas to stay in session, to continue debating this. We need to recess. And within 2 hours, there was an overwhelming response. The Catholic bishops, Jewish community, evangelicals, all pushing back and saying nothing could better honor the Prince of Peace than to pass this treaty that could do more to stop one of the most horrific wars imaginable. And that was kind of one of the final straws that brought this treaty to fruition. When it went to the floor, the faith community was one of three groups. Daryl's was another one that was called in to brief Senate staff on how to speak about this issue, how to move it forward, and ultimately the treaty was passed. So that's one example. And the last one, which I'll go through a little more quickly because it's actually not nuclear related, but in seeing how another security issue worked provides another path forward, is the Arms Trade Treaty that was recently passed. For those of you who may not be familiar, prior to the Arms Trade Treaty, there were no international laws governing the international sale of conventional weapons. Arms Trade Treaty, like New START, had been on the table for a long time. There'd been a long push to do it. The U.S. was vital as the largest exporter of conventional weapons to passing the bill and taking leadership. And what came down to a decision, it was, again, a political decision. The NRA, even though this would have no impact at all on domestic U.S. policy, saw a fundraising opportunity. And they started to fundraise, the UN's coming to take away your guns. They were raising money off it, they were pushing it, it spooked politicians. The U.S. started to pull back, and the faith community responded. There was a call for an International Day of Prayer from African evangelical nations for Americans to join them. Over 100,000 evangelicals and Christians in their churches joined in a day of prayer and fasting for the Arms Trade Treaty. Galen Carey's here at the National Association of Evangelicals. They spoke out directly on the Second Amendment issue and said there is no impact here. That's a red herring to raise the Second Amendment issue. And what that started to flip was, again, in this calculus, now as we move forward through the treaty, the school shootings that now have become very prevalent happened. The NRA's motivations changed. They had bigger fish to fry than just this treaty. They had to worry about a gun bill. And all of a sudden, they had in their own districts, their own members, they had evangelical pastors saying, the NRA is lying to you about this. That changed the calculus for the elected officials and for the NRA. And the final briefing on the Arms Trade Treaty, sponsored by Heritage Foundation, supposed to be sponsored by the NRA, in Congress on the Hill, the NRA didn't show up because they were concerned. They didn't want to have their credibility called into question as the gun bill was moving by pastors who held equal, if not greater, trust and credibility within their communities. Again, helped flip it for the White House, lent its support strongly. The Arms Trade Treaty was passed in the UN, signed by the U.S., and just another example of how the political calculus was shifted by the faith community. And with that, I will pause my stories and pass it on.
Good Good afternoon. My name is David Culp. I'm a lobbyist with the Friends Committee on National Legislation, FCNL. FCNL is one of the oldest religious lobbies here in Washington, set up in the 1940s. And Quakers have been working against nuclear weapons for a very long time. And we're proud that we've got some accomplishments. I've been working on these issues for about 25 years. And before I talk about the way forward, I want to set a little bit of a context and talk about where we've been. So this is simply a simple graph of U.S. employed strategic weapons from the height back in 1987 up to today. And I want to give credit to the Natural Resources Defense Council and also the Federation of American Scientists who put these numbers together and have been doing it for years and years and years. The good news is we have reduced the number of U.S. employed strategic weapons by over 85%, 86%. And most people don't realize that. Yes, it has been a very slow and difficult effort to get those numbers down, but they were accomplished by 3 U.S., Soviet/Russian arms control treaties, also by unilateral reductions by several U.S. presidents. During that same time period, we helped block 5 nuclear bomb plants, 3 nuclear warheads that were proposed. We ended nuclear testing. We added hundreds of millions of dollars to the nuclear nonproliferation budgets. So where do we go from here? For some of you, I want to raise expectations that, yes, progress is possible. For others of you, I want to lower expectations. We're not going to be able to accomplish all of our to-do list this year. What I'm going to suggest is a 4-part agenda, relatively short term. You're going to hear a lot of echoes from Daryl Kimball's talk earlier. Daryl and I have worked together for a long time. And even though we didn't compare notes, there was a lot of similarities here. To me, the most urgent task this year is supporting the Iran nuclear deal. That deal would result in restraining the Iranian nuclear program, and in return, the United States and other countries would lift sanctions. Negotiators are working in Geneva right now to finish that deal by July 20th. Assuming that a deal is reached, the administration then will come to Congress and ask that sanctions be lifted. It's likely that we will see votes in the House and Senate, probably in the lame duck session of Congress right after the midterm elections or in early 2015. If Congress squanders this best opportunity in years to get a nuclear agreement with Iran, it'll be much more difficult to make progress on other non-proliferation issues. This is likely to be the biggest foreign policy victory or defeat of the second Obama term. Issue number 2, in my opinion, is the nuclear budget. You heard this number earlier. I just want to underline it again. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that the cost of modernizing the nuclear weapons enterprise, according to the plans of the Energy Department and Defense Department, would be $355 billion over the next 10 years. Now, this is not some little Quaker group. This is the Congressional Budget Office. $355 billion, that's with a B, capital B, over 10 years. There simply is not enough money to fund these extravagant plans. And that provides opportunities for us to debate these issues. I'll give you one budget example. The B-61 nuclear bomb. This is the last U.S. nuclear bomb in Europe and has reached the end of its useful life. The Pentagon has proposed refurbishing it at the cost of $12 billion. That, even in Washington, is still a lot of money. Last year, we had a vote in the House to reduce this budget by Representative Quigley of Illinois. It got 196 votes, including 25 Republicans. That's the best vote we've had in the House in over a decade. Next week, FCNL will be delivering a letter from over 140 European parliamentarians to Congress calling for a halt in the bomb that is to be redeployed to Europe. This controversy, will not end this year and will go on for years. Budget example number 2, and you saw a diagram of this earlier in the presentation from Dr. Cantor, is the Trident nuclear submarine. The Navy plans to begin replacing the current Trident submarine in the year 2021 with 12 new ones. Each one of those will cost $7 billion each. Each one of those submarines will cost $7 billion each, for a total cost of the program of roughly $100 billion. This story can be repeated several other times with the expensive new budgets for new bombers and new missiles. Congressman Earl Blumenauer and Senator Ed Markey have both introduced legislation to cut the nuclear weapons budget by $100 billion over the next 10 years. These bills are expected to provide text for amendments to the defense authorization and appropriation bills later this year. And right now, both of them are working on getting additional co-sponsors. I want to just give a shout out to Erica Fine. Raise your hand if you want to help us get additional co-sponsors on these bills. Erica has been leading the effort. Priority number 3 is get another strategic arms reduction agreement. And here's where you heard a lot of what I was about to say in Daryl's comments. This is how we're going to move this arrow back down to 0. We have support in the government, including the military, to cut the U.S. nuclear arsenal again by 1/3. And as you heard a number of speakers say, the president had hoped to start negotiations last fall with Russians. Russian President Putin refused to start negotiations. Relations are much worse, obviously, than they were last fall. But those people that have worked on this for a while don't believe that are hopeful that this will not be permanent. Yes, tensions are very high today. But again, if you go back, we've heard several times the Reagan administration at the beginning, tensions were probably higher than they are today. And at the end, Secretary of Defense Carlucci, whose room this is named after, was involved in negotiating first intermediate nuclear forces treaty in Europe, and also starting the negotiation on the first START agreement. So, in my opinion, that is the next step on reducing the nuclear arsenal. The United States and Russia together possess over 90% of the world's arsenal of nuclear weapons. And so at some point, the other countries are going to have to be brought in, but for now, I think the next step is an agreement with the Russians. Item number 4 is the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, or CTBT. And in my opinion, this is probably the most important item on our agenda, but I give you a caution. This is also probably the most difficult. 162 countries have ratified the treaty. The United States has not. It came up for a vote in 1999 in the United States Senate and was overwhelmingly defeated. If that treaty were to be brought up today, it again would be defeated. There simply are not the votes in the U.S. Senate to ratify it today. It takes 67 votes to ratify a treaty. The next Senate that we're going to have next year is going to be more conservative than the one that we have now. You simply take a look at the predictions from the pundits, and there's not much question about that. It may take 2 or 3 election cycles before we get a Senate that would ratify a treaty such as the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. But that is that probably is our most urgent task for the long term. So in conclusion, 4 things I'm suggesting for our work. One is defending the nuclear deal that I think will be reached with Iran in a few weeks. It will require a vote in the Congress probably in November, December. We have to win that one. If we lose, the rest of our agenda becomes much more difficult. Second, the nuclear budget provides opportunities for us. Congress will be debating what our nuclear forces should look like over the next few decades in the midst of intense pressure on the military budget. Third, I do believe that another nuclear arms reduction with Russia is the next step on the reduction path. Yes, it's grim today, but I think that it may be possible after the midterm elections. Fourth, a permanent end to nuclear testing is essential if we're going to eliminate nuclear weapons. And that means U.S. Senate ratification of the CTBT. We don't have the votes today, but that still has got to be one of our most important goals. So yes, progress on nuclear disarmament has been slow and difficult, but we've come a long way. And I have no doubt that we can achieve the elimination of nuclear weapons, but it'll only take place through a determined and focused effort by both the faith community and secular organizations. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for this opportunity to say a few words about the role of the faith community. David and Eric have, I think, focused clearly on the policy challenge before us. My focus is going to be a bit more on what I see as another important role for faith communities, which is shaping the public opinion about the challenge of nuclear disarmament. Pax Christi was founded at the end of the Second World War to support efforts at reconciliation between the French and the Germans after so many years of bitter fighting. As people in Europe and around the world, in communities destroyed by the fighting, struggled to rebuild their lives and relationships, a monstrous legacy of that war, nuclear weapons, became increasingly visible. For most of these 70 years, any discussion about the humanitarian consequences of the use of nuclear weapons was subordinated to the debate about national security and deterrence. We've heard quite a bit about that today. I was a part of an effort in this metropolitan area many years ago, in 1984, called the Blue Ridge Summit, which was intended to highlight the futility, even the absurdity, of the civil defense plans for evacuation of this city in the event of a nuclear attack. We did a mock evacuation on a weekend and took a long trek out to Mount Weather, where the secret underground bunker for high-level government officials, or one of them, was located. Despite a summer-long effort at peace education, very few paid any attention to our message or to our efforts. And it wasn't until very recently that the notion of an evacuation of Washington, D.C. On an emergency basis, which was tried thanks to a snowstorm, became more visibly absurd. My point is that the recently reframed discussion about nuclear weapons, the Humanitarian initiative, is a real sign of hope that citizens of the world, ourselves included, all of us who will be irrevocably harmed in any exchange of nuclear weapons, can take back the initiative and reclaim ownership of nuclear disarmament issues. With the deep involvement, leadership of non-nuclear weapon states, the debate is shifting from what is a traditional nuclear nonproliferation treaty debate on nuclear weapons centered on state security, strategy, and stability to the question of what these weapons do, what the effects would be on humans and on the Earth community, and whether that is compatible with who we are as human beings, whether we as humanity should tolerate their continued existence, and if not, what should be done about that. We've heard that clearly today. The humanitarian impact debate forces states to do some soul searching about what kind of a role for nuclear weapons they see in their national security concepts, whether or not they now possess nuclear weapons. And that, I think, points directly at what we as faith communities should be asking. What kind of people are we of the 20th and 21st centuries? What values shape our political priorities? How do we represent them on the global stage? And what do they say about our concern for future generations? So what might be a way forward? What areas of partnership among faith communities exist? We've heard today quite a lot about how much common ground there is in terms of our responses to the threat posed before us from nuclear weapons, how clearly most of us support a determined move to the abolition of nuclear weapons. We also bring to the effort for nuclear disarmament some very valuable resources, and I think sometimes we lose sight of these. First, and this we have talked about, a values-based way of life that is rooted in respect for the dignity of every person and the integrity of the natural world. The values we cherish are well articulated and very useful in the political arena, in the public square. For example, a challenge to our communities, the communities that we lead, that we're a part of, to think again about what we mean by security and how we experience security. We are positioned to ask that kind of a question. Andrew spoke this morning about ethical principles, respect, interdependence, universal responsibility. And Ibrahim Remy spoke about the moral core of the case against nuclear weapons. The people whose stories need to be told, the human communities that have already been affected by nuclear explosions, by uranium mining, and so on, are members of our communities. We can tell their stories well, and storytelling, as Eric said clearly, is an important part of our traditions. We are also aware, very aware, of the devastating intersection between poverty, the experience of impoverished people, ecological, environmental destruction, and war or preparation for war, most especially nuclear weapons. That intersection is before us always, because we care about impoverished people. We are caring about the earth, and we know that there are connections to how we spend our money, for example. Secondly, broad, even global networks of members or followers are who we are. The global networks of our religious bodies are often well-connected and multifaceted. In the Catholic tradition, the network includes parishes and diocesan structures that span the United States and many of the other nuclear weapon states, hundreds of religious communities, most of which work internationally, and international movements and organizations like Pax Christi. So first, we carry and articulate a value system that is important. Secondly, we are well organized around the world. Third, we have educational institutions and resources, colleges and universities, high schools, grade schools, seminaries, as well as networks of these institutions that link them together. We also have formal and informal educational opportunities in our local communities and our local congregations that we can well take advantage of in raising awareness, raising awareness about the nuclear danger. Fourth, we are communities of prayer and study. Every week around the world, people of faith gather on whatever day is holy to them for a time of prayer or reflection that often includes a message, a sermon, a homily that can be about living faith in these times. Fifth, we have communications capacity. Many of our religious bodies have capacity for publishing, broadcasting, for using social media. Sixth, we have access to almost every sector of society in one way or another, from national political decision makers to media personalities, to scholars, to business leaders, to opinion shapers, to local leaders. Our traditions together touch a very huge sector of our societies. I was deeply involved several years ago in organizing the Jubilee 2000 campaign for debt cancellation in impoverished countries several years ago. As we began that campaign and moved around the country speaking to local communities about the impact of overwhelming foreign debt for very poor countries, what we found was that people in congregations knew very little about debt and would ask questions about the very basics. What kind of debt are you talking about? Are you talking about credit card debt? And so on. Within 1 year, because so many religious congregations in this country adopted that campaign and saw the turn of the millennium as a critical opportunity to raise awareness about it. Within 1 year, the difference in knowledge at a grassroots level in this country was absolutely astounding. When you speak to a group a year later, they would be asking about unsustainable debt and illegitimate debt and had a very sophisticated knowledge of that issue. For me, it was a great experience of the power of using our structures to educate our people about critical issues. I think we could do the same in terms of this issue, because it seems to me that one of the challenges for moving forward the call to move to nuclear abolition is that there is, at least in our country, very little grassroots attention or knowledge of how to do it or why it's important. And I think that is a role that we can play, our ability to educate within our own communities, to bring the prophetic, if you will, into sync with the pastoral work that we do, so that we are challenging our communities not only to know about this issue, but to act in response to it. We can intentionally expand our own interfaith circle, reaching out to those faith communities that are not now attentive to issues of nuclear disarmament. We can focus our advocacy in the very specific ways that David just talked about and that Darrell mentioned earlier. I think perhaps my bottom line definition or description of what I believe our communities can do on this issue and on many other issues, I would describe as an inside-outside strategy. We can go into places of power. We can talk to decision makers. We have to know what we're talking about in order to do that. We also have the capacity to build a grassroots movement that is strong and articulate and committed. I believe that in this instance, we're called to do both. Thank you.
I'm going to talk very briefly. See my mic on? Yeah. I'm going to talk very briefly here because my colleagues really have covered much of the territory. I'm glad Walter started the way that he did, setting a context of dynamics that are with us even today and remembering, you know, we're not a generation that knew not Joseph. These are dynamics that have been going on for decades now, and we need to build on the successes that you talked about, Eric, as a model here, and you've covered much of the territory. I'm going to focus on just a few points about strategies and tactics with the faith community and how it applies to what we've heard. I represent a denomination, a little bit different than groups. Eric also with the Friends Committee, David also with the Friends Committee does here, but they have a long historic focus on these peace issues of one kind or another. Most of the denominations are the quintessential multi-issue entities. And we don't function the way other groups are, that are single issue focused in what they have to do. So, you know, we think we're authorities on everything under the sun. So we have opinions on every domestic and foreign policy issue that America faces and are not hesitant to let our views, which represent the consensus views of the denominations, let them be known in American politics. But because there are so many urgent issues, the budget issues, global climate change, the Middle East peace. You can go down the list of issues that consume the time and attention of multi-issue entities like the major denominations. Getting focus on an issue like this is extraordinarily challenging. It really is. And one of the things over the years that clearly has happened is that there will always be some groups that will be involved in every battle. Some deeply, some a little less so. But if you're going to grab the attention of the religious community, it helps to focus in on one or two issues and to really get everyone mobilized around that. Now, even when that happens, sometimes it can't make a difference if the geopolitics are wrong. I was honored to chair, to go back to Walter's younger days here, a coalition of 20 national religious denominations that were organized on behalf of the passage, the ratification of the SALT II Treaty. Global circumstances made that an absolute non-starter. We didn't move the dial, the religious community, with the moral framing and the moral messages that we had at that time. On the other hand, I can think of a number of cases, you've alluded to some. One can think of the nuclear freeze campaign and what the enormous consensus of the religious community bringing its moral attention to that, the impact it had on the debates. And there are issues sometimes where a few of us focused in on something can really make a difference that others might miss. Council for a Livable World, and we crafted a piece of legislation in the early 1990s when our troops were on the ground in the First Persian Gulf War, and we thought we were facing chemical and biological weapons. You remember, we were all dressed up in those protective gear. We crafted a piece of legislation and imposed some real sanctions on countries and companies that assisted in the proliferation of chemical and biological weapons. Got it passed, I think, unanimously by the Congress, pocket veto by the president. Came back with a version that focused on the corporations more than the countries. The administration argued it was an intrusion on their foreign policy making by the Congress, and got it through, and it was on the books for years and made a difference because a few of us focused in on that and were able to make a compelling moral message. So where there is consensus or where there is a particular focus on issues that others aren't really focused on, the religious communities really can make a deep and profound difference. Secondly, we're particularly good, and this has been alluded to, in framing the moral issues of this. I mean, when global warming became, in part, because of many in the evangelical community who lifted up this frame, the issue of protecting God's creation, it captured the moral imagination of millions and millions of people across the country from a religious standpoint who hadn't been engaged before. And when the Catholic bishops lifted up the mitigation and adaptation on poor countries and poor people, it helped change the debate on those issues in the United States Congress and in some of the international gatherings as well here. But this is a particular hard one to put a human face on. This is not a question of, think of global warming, recycling, or planting a tree, or to make a personal contribution as well as the policy. Because this was going into your backyard and digging up the Trident submarine in your backyard and turning it in here, that would be one thing. It doesn't lend itself to that kind of personal activity, and it's very hard to put personal human faces on this, particularly in a generation when the impact of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is beginning to fade in terms of being a purely historical context and not something that we or our parents, encountered directly. So we have to find ways to try and engage people. And finally, I would simply point out that the religious communities in America are also the quintessential bipartisan entities. Our pews are filled with Republicans and Democrats, liberals, moderates, conservatives. There is not a single denomination, no matter what your image of us are, Reformed Jews, the Quaker, you go to the Middle West in some of the Quaker communities, and you got rock rib conservatives in many ways. There are ways that we can often access people to bring messages to people who otherwise wouldn't be there. And being more sophisticated about how to use the religious community to identify political influentials, donors, supporters, personal friends of crucial members of Congress Congress whose votes are needed for this legislation, who can bring the moral message to them. Here often can be very effective in the immigration battles going on, in the end of vote. We got through the Senate this year, in several other bills just this year. I can give examples of where key people like this, people who are Republicans and didn't agree in general with their denominations, but on the particular issue involved did, open up the doors to people who weren't taking meetings from anyone else in ways that really had an impact on some of these votes. You know, there needs to be a more sophisticated effort to use the religious community's access to people across America, and to use their help in framing the moral messages in ways that can reach the grassroots of America. With that, I'll stop and open up. And I need to apologize. This is running a bit later than anticipated. I may have to slip out before the end of the session, but you got the real expert sitting here, so.
Let me ask one question, because I just want to pick up, and because I'm so driven by the politics of all this as against the morality. I mean, David listed 4 items, and he started off with saying that if you didn't get the Iran agreement through Congress, you're going to have trouble with every one of these other issues you're talking about. How did the 3 others of you see that, and could your groups be active in that sphere?
Well, I'd say, I mean, the Iran issue, not only will it affect others, but I mean, it is the potential for a massive, it's one of the biggest threats we face as a nation and definitely as a world. I mean, the consequences, if that goes the wrong way, of what could happen are devastating. And so when in work, David has done much more on it, but as we've kind of worked on the periphery of that issue, it has been in the context of failure is not an option when it comes to Iran, because the consequence, I mean, we are facing a World War I type scenario again, and how it could spread if that gets out of hand.
But let me just interject the kind of detail that I get hooked on. The Iranians are insisting they have the right to reprocess at a level at 5%. And the Congress, in the main, refuses to accept that. Now, how do you talk to your people about an issue like that the public at large doesn't focus on?
You want to go first?
Look, I think you said it would be one of the greatest achievements, the greatest failures of the second term. I think in the scope of world history, it might turn out to be one of the greatest failures if it does fail. I'm not sure politically it will be. In other words, I think there's such cynicism and skepticism about Iran that I think a lot of people don't think that there will be a success. I think if they succeed in doing something, it will be one of the great successes of this of the second term. Look, there's no segment of the American community that would be more gratified, more enthusiastic, and more supportive of actually preventing the development of nuclear military capability in Iran than the Jewish community. The devil's going to be in the details on this. You gave one example. You could have given 10 others. It isn't a question of will people jump on board if a good treaty comes through. It's what defines a good treaty. What happens if it's not? If it's 3%, 5%, 10%? What happens if it is? If they don't agree on the number of centrifuges that can be maintained on this, and they're enough that it would still keep open a possibility, although making it more difficult and delay the development of nuclear. I mean, there's an infinite number of details that I think we'll all be hung up on as to what will happen. It's really difficult to answer until the end of it. But I do concur, this is truly crucially important. It's not just crucially important directly for American interests, but in terms of that region, the stability in that region. If you want to see the escalation of the nuclear arms race, if Iran gets a nuclear capability, even if there is no use of it or anything here, it's going to lead to a massive thing, and I think a far greater possibility of nuclear technology or actual nuclear weapons ending up in the hands of non-state forces. I think those chances will escalate significantly. We're already serious enough in Pakistan and areas in other areas of the world, but this is in North Korea. But this is would be an enormous escalation of that threat.
I'll try and give a short answer because we could be here for hours just on this one question of yours, Walter. You opened up a can of worms. In my opinion, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty allows civilian use of nuclear energy. The problem is that Iran didn't live up to its commitments under the NPT. It hid what it was doing. There's no question about that. They had secret facilities. They weren't truthful to the IAEA. What they were doing is very clear that they were engaged in activities that could have led to producing a nuclear weapon. So then the question comes in, okay, so maybe they had the right, but they also were cheating, and so where does that leave us? It comes down to going forward, what is the best arrangement for the United States, for the world, for the Middle East? I would argue a strong treaty with a strong agreement with verification by the IAEA is the best way forward. I think if the deal completely falls apart, my fear is that, in fact, yes, they completely break out of all the constraints they have now, and 5 years down the road have a nuclear weapon. And that's the one point that David and I 100% agree on, that it's about the worst outcome you can think of. So how do you put in place an arrangement, an agreement, where we've forestalled their nuclear program and we've got a verification? And I think the agreement that the administration is negotiating, I'm hopeful will be a good one. But we're going to have lots of time to debate this all fall.
We're running late, so if anybody has a question.
I think about 2 questions.
Yeah.
There you go.
Is it on? I think if you keep talking, we'll catch up with you.
No problem about that. Morality is a compass point. It's not a policy. And it's for the long term. Without morality, law and policy will always lead to tyranny. And morality without law and policy has no traction. I was particularly struck by Mr. Pincus's diminishing the role of moral argument. Indeed, a moral argument might not be practical, but to have a practical position and a practical policy that doesn't meet a moral standard is very dangerous. Because without a moral compass, a policy could be an improved means to an unimproved end. And thus, I would say it's our responsibility to have a moral test on policy. And with respect to the existential issues that humanity faces, to approach them without a moral compass, I believe would be terribly irresponsible. And thus, I think the moral compass on this issue is absolutely imperative and not an option. I was particularly struck by the way the press reported on the dozens of missileers who cheated, outraged that they cheated, with no hard discussion about what they were being tested to be able to do. It was a competency and an ability and a willingness to extinguish humanity in an afternoon. That should have been the front page.
I guess when you're dealing with me, you're dealing with somebody who thinks that morality is a subjective situation, having traveled and been involved in covering wars in which people did horrible things because they felt they were right. There is no single, in my mind, standard of what is moral. Each one of us has a view of right and wrong. And a lot of it depends on where you were brought up, how you were brought up, and how you've lived your life. To get everybody here upset, I know the people that were involved in the, quote, enhanced interrogation, and I know the pressures they were under and put under. And in the case of waterboarding, these are people who were told, who raised questions and told by the Justice Department and by the president that this was legal. And to turn around on them and say they were wrong to do it. If you were here on 9/11 and 9/12, I can tell you there were people throughout the city that would have taken steps that I thought horrendous because of the fear that sat in this town. And it's still there on terrorism. So that going back through wars, and then even that one experience said to me, you have your own moral compass and you live by it.
And you stated that certain actions were horrific. That's a moral standard. And that's why Nuremberg's so important as to the second question. Thank you.
Could I just add something to that, too? My sense of faith and morality is that it's most effective when it's not used as a justification, but as a call. And I think where we are best is not when we say, you have to do this because God said, or you're wrong because this is the wrong thing, but where we are able to articulate our values and draw people to us, and that's the strength of the moral argument. And on all the policy issues, as I came out, I was a Senate committee staffer and did budget stuff, so I came from a policy perspective, but I now do communications mostly. Most people do not think in all the details, and we know from lots of studies, people don't make decisions with their heads, it's with their hearts. And so it is the best way to connect. And while we have to get all the policy details right, be it Iran, nuclear issues, whatever it is, the way we will move things is by connecting with people through a values frame and a moral one. And it's that common call that I think is the strength of the moral argument.
We have time for just one more question.
Last week, the Hawaii Supreme Court ruled the state can deny health benefits to Marshallese migrants. Is anybody pressuring the federal government to pick up where the state formally covered the Marshallese and the Micronesian Compact of Free Association migrants? The court ruled the state is right to drop their benefits. Have you heard of anybody speaking up for the COFA migrants?
I hate to throw in a word. I'm writing a book about the Marshall Islands and what happened to them in the radiation testing, which is a horrendous story, both for our government, but also for the Marshallese leadership, which has played an active role in making things difficult. But the cases are still pending in court.
I would just add that I think that is a perfect example of what I think our storytelling task is about, that unless we know about the story of what happened to the Marshall Islanders and to the miners in New Mexico and on, we don't gather to respond to a situation of injustice like that. So I think that is an example of a story that's very real, just as the examples of the impact on climate that we heard about earlier this morning.
Well, I want to thank the panel.
May I or no? You can veto me.
A short one, okay.
Yeah, okay, short. Yeah, Tad Daly with the Center for War Peace Studies. I actually want to ask you all about something that Daryl Kimball said, and Daryl can speak to it if he wants to, but particularly Walter Pincus, who I think might have the answer to this. Daryl reminded us that candidate Barack Obama said, this hair trigger alert the ability to launch nuclear weapons like 10 or 15 minutes after the president might order such an action. And this policy of launch on warning, by which if you look at a computer screen and the computer screen says nuclear missiles are coming at you, the policy is to launch before they actually hit the ground. Darrell reminded us that candidate Obama said that was a bad idea, ought to get rid of it. And also, candidate Bush said that's a bad idea, we ought to get rid of it. So what's going on? Here we've had 2 consecutive presidents that once they become president, they haven't done it. I really want to know, obviously somebody is getting to somebody and preventing a change in this infinitely dangerous policy that puts us all in peril. So why hasn't it happened?
I guess I wrote about it 12 years ago. I went down the silo. It's one of the most extraordinary events that these officers are sitting there on 24-hour tours and have been sitting there for 40 years waiting for essentially an order they know is never going to come. And when I got involved in it, they were all taking courses, trying to read to eat up the time, but they also do exercises. There are members of Congress who have refused to sort of allow that to happen. I mean, there's an amendment attached to the past 2 appropriation bills that say that the president can't reduce weapons on his own, even under the START treaty, until certain things happen. So you have to remember, you're dealing with a Congress that doesn't essentially have people that agree with you, and nobody is interested enough to sort of take on the fights to do away with it. One of the arguments about keeping them on alert, which is a kind of ridiculous argument, is that if you don't train that way, you can't go back in fast enough in case somebody decides they're going to attack. It's not going to happen. But I also have to make people think launch on warning doesn't exist. There are a lot of stops along the way. The movies make it much easier than people think. But it's an issue. It's one of these nuclear issues people don't pay attention to.
Thank you.
On that note, that good question and that thoughtful answer, I want to thank our panelists, and this afternoon's panel was a very interesting